like war or arms or killing people. It's going to have to be settled with the Minsk group. Now, the Minsk group is co-chaired by U.S., Russia, and France. And we're calling on both Armenia and Azerbaijan to come to the table and talk with these three co-chairs or add new co-chairs if they want to. But anything they can agree on that they would then accept an arbitration with is what we are asking them to do.
Okay, thank you so very much, Madam Ambassador. Really great to talk with you as always. That's Ambassador Kay Bailey Hutchinson, U.S. Ambassador to NATO. Still ahead, the Hummer is back, but this time it's all electric. We hear from GM President Mark Royce. That's coming up next, and this is Bloomberg.
Some things you see coming, some things you don't. The trick is to be ready for anything. John from Infrastructure Support is working every day to keep essential market data flowing seamlessly. We keep on, so you can keep on.
We explore the trends, investments, and competition of the European ETF industry. Join us on Bloomberg ETF IQ Europe.
Hello, hello. Welcome again to another live trading. Today we have the Euro USD here, the USD Swiss franc, the gold, and GBP Swiss franc, the British pound and Swiss franc here. You'll add another cell here. Okay, the gold here, we will add another one. Okay. Okay. Stay with us and enjoy the streaming.
GMC is really the only premium truck brand out there if you think about it. Most of our competitors are brand extensions for that. So we have GMC and we have Hummer in a premium channel for trucks. And that's a very distinguishable piece of what we're doing with both brands. You have the AT4 and the AT4X. And things like that for GMC, and I think you'll see that that grow. But then you have the Hummer, the Hummer model under the GMC umbrella as well, which is sort of the ultimate off-road piece of that. So very carefully designed and executed with different attributes, different designs, and different go-to-market strategies.
Mark, you mentioned competitors. Let's talk about competitors in the EV space. You have Ford now with an F-150 EV they've announced. You've got, of course, Tesla with their pickup truck. How does this compare, this Hummer EV? Are they direct competitors against them? Are you going for a somewhat different market?
I think it's like nothing else, and I'll leave it at that. This truck is very different from what our competitors have described most recently with the EV piece of the light-duty pickup truck, and then quite a few months back with what the other electric-only competitor is doing with their truck. And I don't really know until we see those come into the marketplace what those trucks are, but I can tell you what this is, and this is right now like nothing else.
Talk about what maybe a sister truck, the Badger from Nikola. GM obviously announced a fairly large arrangement with Nikola. A lot of controversy around it. Is the Badger going forward? Do you see that as something complementary to what you're doing with the Hummer EV?
Well, you know, we won't sell and market that truck. That'll be Nikola's. That's what Nikola's doing. And the big difference there is that truck will have a fuel cell. And so it's still a fuel cell electric truck, but quite different from what we're offering with our Ultium packs on the pure electric Hummers. So very different. But
as far as you know, the Badger and the Nikola deal is going forward.
Right now, we are going forward. And so the exciting piece of this is they're taking what is, I believe, the best fuel cell in the world with our fuel cell that is made in our joint venture with Honda right here in Michigan, and taking that fuel cell and looking at deploying it in the heavy-duty transport market with the large trucks, you know, the Class 7 and 8s, and then also in the light-duty Badger truck that you mentioned. So, yes.
So with the Hummer EV, put this in the larger context of General Motors and its move into electric vehicles. You've announced the Lyriq, the Cadillac Lyriq. Now you have the Hummer EV. As I understand it, there's a Bolt EUV coming out as well. How does this fit into the overall portfolio that you're developing, and what comes next?
It's a great question. If you look at the way we've designed the platforms, both on the truck platform, our BET battery electric truck platform, and then our battery electric vehicle platform, those two dedicated platforms are quite different. And that approach is quite different than many others that are introducing electric vehicles. The reason why I say that is because, again, we're deploying you know, our modular pack, our Ultium battery source out of our Lordstown plant in Ohio. That is designed and executed to be high volume. And the reason why that's important, again, for the customer and for the market is because we can really take, because of scale and chemistry that we've developed. In fact, right here, we have a chemistry developing lab for our cells and our packs right here at the Tech Center in Warren, Michigan. That quick development of chemistry and then deploying that chemistry into our Ultium packs is really the secret behind you know, driving that cost down so that we can offer not only Hummers and Cadillacs, but Bolt EUVs and beyond for the mass market piece of our other brands that do higher volume right in the heart of the market, like Chevrolet and you know, Chevrolet crossovers, trucks, all of those vehicles. And so this has been really, really done very carefully, and that goes also into the electric motors that we're doing ourselves.
That was GM President Mark Royce on the all-new Hummer EV coming out at the end of next year. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. The UK is taking more steps to fight the coronavirus pandemic. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has expanded the areas that will fall under the tightest virus restrictions. Speaking in London, Prime Minister Johnson said he is focused on local restrictions as opposed to a national lockdown.
So that we all, and particularly those regions that are now, alas, under Tier 3 restrictions, all the regions of the country bounce back strongly together.
The restrictions on South Yorkshire come a day after the Prime Minister imposed similar measures on Greater Manchester, following the breakdown of talks with local leaders over the scale of financial assistance. Canadian lawmakers are considering the creation of a special committee to investigate potential misuse of COVID-19 spending. That's prompted Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to threaten a snap election. Prime Minister Trudeau could face a backlash from Canadians who are suffering through a second wave of COVID-19 and may have little patience for political infighting. COVID-19 has taken a well-documented toll on the education of America's children, but experts say it also poses a threat to their nutrition. In a typical year, the government helps feed almost 30 million students a day, or about 1 in 2. Now, because of COVID-19, most districts are delivering less than half as many meals as usual. Officials say that's contributing to an alarming increase in child hunger as food banks around the country report soaring demand. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Thanks so much, Mark. We're going to stay on the subject of COVID-19 because there's some breaking news now. Just a short time ago, we learned that New York State is reporting over 2,000 new COVID-19 cases for the first time since last May. The positivity rate in hotspots, including parts of Brooklyn, Queens, and Rockland County, was up to 6.6%. And for more on that, we turn to our colleague now, Michael McKee. So, Mike, this is not up to the levels of June, but it's heading in a bad direction right now, it feels like.
It's heading a bad direction, and the problem is this is community spread, and this is what everybody has been worried about. We've seen it in other states, and we've seen it most recently in Connecticut and New Jersey. Governor Cuomo saying he wanted to work with those two states because there's no real way to lock the border between them since so many people commute, particularly into New York City. The concerns are still based in terms of New York City around the borough of Manhattan. They're in Brooklyn and Queens particularly, but also, the governor said, along the Pennsylvania border. So we're starting to see upticks in other places. Manhattan's gotten a little bit worse. About a week ago, the infection rate was about 0.5%. It's now up to almost 1%. And so we are seeing the spread of COVID again in New York, which had been one of the better states out there. And so at this point, it looks like nobody is immune.
Well, Michael, obviously the question that all of us have in mind is, okay, what does that mean? What's to be done about it? We heard from the governor yesterday saying, look, he's fighting the COVID-19. He's also fighting to try to reopen the economy. Are we talking about lockdowns, do we think?
Well, what they've already done some lockdowns, David, of course, in Brooklyn in particular, where they forced bars and restaurants to close except for home delivery in certain neighborhoods, and also restricted the number of people who could gather together, even at churches. And that may be coming for other parts of the city and other parts of the state. They would prefer to do that than to impose the kind of general lockdown that we saw come in March. It did enormous damage to the New York City economy, and we still haven't recovered. As people can go back to work, they're finding a lot of places didn't reopen.
Yeah, exactly right. You can see that right around our offices here at Bloomberg. Thank you so much to our colleague, Michael McKee. We want to turn back to stimulus now. Yesterday, we talked with House Speaker Nancy Pelosi about her hopes for getting another round of stimulus done before the election. And she has even today on MSNBC said things are looking good. But now we want to go to the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue and welcome White House Deputy Press Secretary Brian Morgenstern. Brian, thank you very much for being with us, and thank you for your patience there. Give us your perspective from the White House. Are you happy with the way things are going, the way Nancy Pelosi says she is?
Well, look, I think today we've got reason for a little more optimism than we've had in recent days. I think the parties are actually talking, exchanging ideas. We're seeing the speaker move maybe in ways that she hasn't over the course of the last 90 days. The administration has remained consistently in support of paycheck protection, funds for small businesses, funding to get schools open, stimulus checks for hardworking Americans, unemployment insurance help. We're kind of having that conversation about liability protections and on onshoring manufacturing, really a more robust discussion. The chief will be on the Hill talking with senators today, seeing how far we can move the ball down the field. The Speaker and the Secretary, Stephen Mnuchin, will speak again this afternoon. I think both sides are rightfully projecting a little bit of optimism compared to where we have been over the past several months, because the Speaker really was unwilling to move, and it seems like we're coming a little bit closer together.
Well, and Brian, I don't want to get in the middle of this negotiation. I won't do that, but I will say that the Speaker yesterday on the question of liability indicated there is some middle ground. It was not an all or nothing proposition if it's limited to COVID-19, but the other bookend, as she called it, was actually state and local assistance. Where are we on that?
Yeah. So we still have differences there. The estimates that our folks have been looking at in terms of what the state and local governments would need as a result of losses from the COVID virus, we're looking at 250, 275 billion in that range. The Speaker is still far, far above that. And the president still believes that we should not be spending money on things that literally have nothing to do with COVID. So it remains an area of disagreement, but the conversations are happening. And as I've said, I think over the next 48 hours or so, we'll see how things play out. But today, it was an optimistic morning, and it remains an optimistic afternoon as talks continue.
Brian, we're up a little bit of a deadline with the election coming 13 days from now, although the speaker yesterday said, you know what, we could also do it after that. I'd like to do it before, we could do it after. Is President Trump committed to getting this stimulus done? Because he said he wants stimulus and he wants to be big, even if it goes after the election.
Yes, so that is an option, and the Treasury Secretary said something similar recently. And so, look, getting it done, we've wanted to get it done for the past, I think it's 92, 93 days at this point, but there's sort of a, we can't do it at all costs. We have to have some bounds of reasonability here. We have to be actually addressing problems facing the American people, keeping people connected to their jobs, ensuring adequate liquidity when they face problems due to the coronavirus. But if things drift past the election, we're not going to stop talking. But we've always wanted to get it done. As I said, over the last 92 days, we continue to want to get it done as soon as possible.
And are people working around the clock over at Treasury, that behind you there at the White House? Are people working around the clock to get this done?
Oh, absolutely. These things have not stopped. The Secretary, of course, has been on a tour through the Middle East, and he's continued to have these conversations even as he is literally halfway around the world. Our chief, Mark Meadows, remains engaged. Conversations ongoing with our staff in the Hill, making sure, as you know, David, I think sometimes negotiations like this are a bit of a game of whack-a-mole. When you move in one direction, part of one caucus may go in the other. So you have to kind of, maintain the glue to keep everybody together. We are continuing to use our best efforts to try and do that, as I said, to emphasize the administration's priorities of keeping people who work for small businesses connected to their jobs, stimulus checks for adequate liquidity, unemployment insurance. The president has taken unilateral actions with his executive orders. Those won't last forever. We will need help from Congress, and of course we want it as soon as we can get it.
Brian, a lot of us, you and we, are really focused on stimulus, but there are other issues as well pending. We do have the election coming up. Give me your sense, as your position as a White House spokesperson, what is the message for going into this election that you want to get across to the American people? What's the central message?
Yeah. So President Trump is the jobs president. His agenda of tax cuts, deregulation, improved trade deals, unleashing America's energy sector has led to the strongest, most inclusive economy we've seen. His response to the coronavirus of getting treatments and a vaccine to market in record time, using the Defense Production Act to get PPE all around the country, reducing the risks of the virus so that we can safely reopen. He wants, again, the strongest and most inclusive economy. The other side, we're looking at draconian tax increases, potentially more lockdowns. The data is just not supporting that. We're not seeing spread in workplaces and schools. We can reopen in a safe way because President Trump has taken unprecedented steps to put us in this position, and his economic agenda is going to lead to more jobs and higher wages for the American people, and less wars and more peace deals than the previous administration. So definitely a safer and more prosperous way of life.
Brian, I know firsthand that no matter how much you want to control a message, sometimes it gets out away from you and it's hard to really control it. I want to talk about, just for one moment, the Leslie Stahl 60 Minutes thing. I've been involved in some of those interviews. Sometimes they go well, sometimes they don't. Clearly, it didn't come out the way you wanted. What happened?
Well, I think the president's actually quite proud of it. He likes to joust. He enjoys hostile interviews. He wants to make sure that he gets a fair shake, that there isn't some deceptive editing going on. And so I think he wants to make sure that the whole thing's out there, that his fulsome answers are reported because he's quite proud of them. He doesn't want to be misportrayed. So I think that's really what this is about, is holding the press accountable and making sure that the reporting is accurate and fairly representing his answers.
Okay, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time today, Brian. That's Brian Morgenstern, a very busy White House Deputy Press Secretary. Tomorrow night is the second and last presidential debate before the election, 13 days from right now, with President Trump looking to make up what looks like some lost ground in the polls, if they're to be believed. We welcome now one of the few who has actually been on the debate stage with former Vice President Biden. He is Tom Steyer, who ran against Mr. Biden for the nomination. He is the founder of Farallon Capital, as well as the nonprofit Next Gen America, and so many other things. And we welcome him now back to Bloomberg. Tom, thank you so much for being with us. Start with the debate. What is it like to debate against Joe Biden? What advice would you have for Joe Biden as he goes into the debate tomorrow night?
Well, David, I think that Joe Biden is a very calm, confident debater. I think he comes through as what he is, which is somebody who really cares about the American people. He doesn't get too complicated. He sticks to his basic points, and he comes through as a very caring individual. So I think that from the standpoint of the debate stage, he won the first debate with Mr. Trump hands down. And I think it was a huge plus for the campaign because he kept his cool, he kept his awareness of the facts, and he just did a great job, and I'm expecting something similar tomorrow night.
Okay, so I'm sure you don't have time to watch Saturday Night Live, but if you did last Saturday, actually portrayed Vice President Biden as sort of Mr. Rogers. Is that a comfortable position? By the way, is that a bad position for him to be taking right now, given what's going on across this debate stage for him?
Well, I think that the idea, I think when you say Mr. Rogers, you know, wearing that very comforting sweater, you have a candidate who first and foremost relates to the American people, whose policies are really a reflection of his caring for and confidence in the brains and the hard work of Americans. So I think that that attitude that we're going to have the exact opposite of Mr. Trump, that we're going to have an experienced, caring person who's going to rely on experts and make decisions based on the facts, is going to be a sea change in a very good way for America. And I think that that comes across on the debate stage, and it's very reassuring and positive.
Tom, last time you were here, we spent a fair amount of time talking about the wildfires in California. I really want to know, what's the status of those now? I mean, they were tragic, really historic. What's going on with the wildfires right now? Well,
we've moved past the worst part of it by far, David, and the air is clear back in California. And so, you know, it's important to remember, though, that the news on climate from around the world is terrible. You know, yes, we've had more than double any fire, you know, in terms of acreage burned in California this year. We've had a record number of storms in the Gulf, record number. We have news coming from the poles about sea rise and about the melting of the permafrost that's very threatening. So there's no question that we have an absolute need to deal with this urgently. And to be clear, Joe Biden's plan does deal with this so-called Build Back Better plan, does deal with this urgently. And it's a place where the difference between Joe Biden and Donald Trump is enormous. The gulf couldn't be bigger. We have a candidate who is dealing with science, acknowledging it, and then coming up with a plan that doesn't just deal with climate, but creates millions of good-paying union jobs and deals with environmental justice, you know, part of the systemic racism in our society, versus a candidate who literally can't admit to the problem, just as he can't deal with COVID, he has no plan. You know, this is the urgency of climate is a perfect example of the difference between these candidates, and is a perfect reason about why we're going to have historic turnout in America this year, because Americans realize we're at a turning point, and we absolutely have to choose the positive, future-oriented path that Joe Biden's laying out. There's just no question about it. Tom, finally, talk to me about the California economy. I know you've been on the panel that Governor Newsom really appointed to get the economy open again. It's not been a straight path, I think. I was really taken aback by the fact that the Walt Disney Company now is really objecting to the way that it's being handled. Bob Iger, at one point, I think, was on the panel with you. He's the executive chairman of Walt Disney Company. What's going on there? Because Disney's saying, look, they let us open in Orlando, but not out in Anaheim. Well, I think what's going on is that Governor Newsom made the determination, and I think it's right, that for us to get the robust recovery we want, we need to get the virus under control. And that means that there are protocols and rules about all the different businesses and industries in terms of when you get to open a restaurant and when you get to open a gymnasium and when you get to open a school and when you get to open a theme park. And Governor Newsom has stuck to his guns and insisted that we keep Californians safe. And those numbers are very much reflected in the health and safety of Californians and how he's protected them. And so the bet has been from the beginning, and our task force has supported him in this, that first and foremost protect the health and safety of Californians, and then we'll get, because all the data says then you get the most robust recovery. So it's, his health officials told him that that was a bad thing to do, to allow Disneyland to open as soon as the Walt Disney Company would like, and he stuck to his guns and went with health and safety. And I think we're seeing that that's absolutely supported by the level of infection and also the death rate. So I think this is another example of where we have a Democratic governor dealing with science, caring about the health and safety of his constituency and doing the right thing. It's the exact opposite, honestly, of the failed non-response to COVID that our president has had, which is no plan, no rules, an actual denial that it even matters or is happening, and an attempt to smooth it over. And you can see that around the country. That is a policy which is leading to, spikes in infection rates and spikes in deaths that apparently Mr. Trump doesn't care about.
Tom, it's always a pleasure, as well as really helpful to have you on. That's Tom Steyer. He's the former Democratic presidential candidate and founder of Farallon Capital. And tomorrow, please be sure to tune in for Bloomberg's special coverage of the final presidential debate. That will start at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Coming up, the mayor of Orlando, Buddy Dyer, on what's going on with his city with COVID and with the economy. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Bloomberg Television is reinventing one of the most iconic brands in financial television for a new audience. Join me to see the news program for the clever investor. This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Florida continues to battle COVID even as it looms large as a factor in the election just 13 days from now. We welcome now the mayor of Orlando. He's Buddy Dyer, for an update on how his city is doing and what he expects on November 3rd. So, Mr. Mayor, thank you very much for being back with us. Appreciate it. First of all, start with COVID. How's it going?
We're pressing on. Our positive rate's about 5% right now. It's been hovering, was a little below, but since we've opened back up, we're in the 5% and a little higher than that. So we're doing pretty well. People are still heeding, even though the governor opened the state up, the people in Orange County anyways, in Central Florida, are continuing to wear their masks, continuing to social distance, continuing to do the right things to keep everybody safe.
Well, talk about that opening up some. How much is open? How much success are you having? I know that, for example, Disney World is open back up, limited but open.
Yeah, most businesses are open.
We'll see what happens. Talk with Leader McConnell. Nancy Pelosi at this moment does not want to do anything that's going to affect the election, and I think it will affect the election negatively for her. So we'll see what happens, but there are talks going on as we speak. Have you talked with Leader McConnell? I don't want to comment on that. But the Republicans will come along.
President, why did you criticize Dr. Fauci? Does it have anything to do with his high standing in public sentiment?
No, I think really Dr. Fauci's a very nice man, but we let him do what he wants to do. He gets a lot of television. He loves being on television, and we let him do it. Sometimes he says things that are a little bit off, and they get built up, unfortunately, but he's a nice guy. I like him, but he's called a lot of bad calls. He said, don't wear a mask, and he said, don't ban China. They were bad calls. He admits that, and I don't hold that against him. If I did, I wouldn't have him. No, I think he's a nice guy. Huh? I don't want to. I don't want to hurt him. He's been there for about 350 years. I don't want to hurt him.
Derek, let's start with the Supreme Court decision. How significant is this?
Hey, Anne-Marie, you know, it's actually kind of significant here. What you're talking about is the difference between when mail-in ballots can be received and counted. You know, in a lot of states, the rule had been that you had to get your ballot in by Election Day. But states more and more have been going to the idea of, no, you know what, you just got to drop it in the mail by Election Day, and then when it gets there, it gets there. So this is going to allow for a couple more mail-in ballots to be able to come in. Now, why that's significant, Pennsylvania is a swing state. Joe Biden's winning there in the polls by about 4 points. It's a state Donald Trump carried. He feels like he has to win. And these mail-in ballots, as you and I have discussed many times before, are skewing Democratic. So theoretically, this would allow a couple more ballots of the type that have been skewing Democratic to come in. There still may be further challenges on this, Anne-Marie, and keep in mind, Amy Coney Barrett would be a sixth Republican vote on the Supreme Court. The case that you mentioned was decided only 4-4, so she could break a tie if this came up for a challenge after the election.
I want to move on to the debate we're expecting on a Thursday. There's going to be changes after the last one, which was chaotic, to put it simply. What are the changes?
Well, the big change is that there's going to be a mute button, which is to say that after somebody gets asked a question, in their 2 minutes of time that they have to start answering initially, the other candidate's microphone is going to be muted. Now, is that going to get rid of all of the sound if someone interrupts? Probably not, because they're going to be in the same room. Microphones can pick things up. But the idea is to try and bring a little bit of structure. I will say, this is a bit unprecedented to give people a mute button in a presidential debate. There's actually a fair number of people who want a more orderly process who don't actually support this move. Donald Trump said, two reporters on Air Force one of ours was with him. He said, I don't like this change, but I'm going to go ahead and do the debate anyway. So we're still expecting Trump to show up, even though he hates this change.
Let's do exactly what you said. Let's go forward to Election Day and back time it, as we say in the broadcasting business. What do we have to do between here and there to get there? Assuming that you do have the basic terms you've worked out and you work on, when do you have to have the language of a bill? When do you have to call back your members for a vote? What does the next week or 10 days look like?
Well, of course, the final piece is the president signing the legislation. And for that to happen, it not only has to pass the House, but it has to pass the Senate. And you know, we're getting mixed messages. The Senate's saying one thing, the president says he wants to spend more money than I do. But as I've said before, it's not about the money, it's how the money is spent. You know, we want a child tax credit for the poorest kids in America. They want to retain a tax net operating loss benefit for the wealthiest people in our country. And we're saying, well, you know, how do we reconcile that?
Which
So
was
it's
in the
not
CARES
price.
Act, right? That was actually in the CARES
It's in
Act.
the CARES, and we take it out, and they're insisting on keeping it in. So as I say, it's never, not always just the price, it's the money and how it is spent. So that's one thing. So anyway, engineering back to have it for election day, I would think we'd have to have this finished by the end of next week. In order for that to do it, we'd have to have our legislation all written by the end of this week. Then it's, you know, you have all your procedural 72 hours of review for the world to see, and then it would come to the floor, and then the Senate, you know, has different procedures, so it would have to be, but this is really to have it for, now I'm not, you know, we could still continue the negotiation. It might not be finished by election day.
Right.
It may be finished by election day, but I want it by the next Friday. See, I wanted it at a time where people could pay the rent. November 1st, rent day. Let's see if we can't do that. If that's not possible, it doesn't mean that the virus should not still be crushed, that we shouldn't be putting money in the pockets of the American people, that we shouldn't be honoring our heroes. We still should have a responsibility to continue the negotiations should we just not come to enough of an agreement, a reconciliation of our differences. But we're on a path. And you have to be optimistic. As I say, the secretary and I say to each other, if we didn't believe we could get this done, why would we even be talking to you?
Is the election going to be a repeat of 2016? I think so. I think we'll do better than 2016. We're way ahead of where we were in 2016. And I've done things that nobody's ever done. We built the greatest economy in the world, and we're building it rapidly again. If you look at Arizona, you look at the job they've done, and I'm just leaving other states. I mean, every one of these Republican-run states are doing phenomenally. The Democrat-run states are not, but they're not going to affect our numbers very much. I think they're going to open up on November 4th. They'll be opening up on November 4th. And by the way, the fact that Kristen Welker is, you know, a dyed-in-the-wool radical left Democrat or whatever she is. Okay, then ask, why are you defending her? Then ask her, why did she delete her account? Would you please have her put her account back? And you know what? It's not going to affect, I know you want to stick up. It's not going to affect me. I'm going to be there. But, you know, I told you about the last one, and I was right. And I told you about Savannah Guthrie, and I was right. And I'm telling you about Kristen Welker. Kristen Welker should put all of her statements back on. She deleted her entire account. She shouldn't do that. What am I doing to prepare? I'm doing this. I've done very well in debates, and you know, you do what you do. You just do what you do. The last debate I had 2-on-1. I usually have 2-on-1 at least, and I did well on the last debate, and we did well with Savannah Guthrie based on reports. But all you can do is look. You know, you go around. We do interviews with you. This is like, I call this debate prep. This is actually tougher than a debate, if you want to know the truth.
Will you do the testing before the debate, and will you authorize will you do the testing before the debate, and will you yes, the COVID testing, and will you authorize your doctors to tell us when
Sure, I would have no problem with it. I'm not only am I free, positive, or whatever, what would you call it? I'm totally free, right? Not only am I free, I'm immune, they say. They say if you've had it, you're immune. Now, the question is, are you immune for 4 months or for the rest of your life? That's the only thing we don't know.
Will you authorize your doctors to tell you when you tested negative last before the last
Is that
debate?
very important to you? You
Yes,
seem
sure
to
it
be
is.
so intent. But if it's so important to you, why is it so important to you?
Because we want to know how long
I know,
you may
but why?
have been.
Why?
We want to know if you followed the rules.
I know, but why is it so important to you? Look at the dedication. Yeah, my doctors have already given it. You know, my doctors have given more information than has been given on any human being in the history of the world.
Millions of people have already voted, haven't they?
Yeah, that's right. There's more than 28 million people who have already registered ballots in the presidential election. I mean, it's quite a staggering term of people who have already voted here. And reasonably right now, we're seeing that Democrats are banking this early vote more than Republicans. Now, Republicans are planning to vote, we hear from surveys, a lot more on Election Day. Certainly they are going to make up much of that gap on Election Day. But polls show Biden to be ahead on average about 9 points right now. And I took a look before coming on with you, and it's interesting to note that if you compare polls 15 days out from what actually happened on Election Day, the median differential between those is 1 percentage point. There's only been 2 elections in the last 12 where it's varied by more than 2.1 percentage points. Now, the Trump campaign will tell you that one of those deviations was 2016, and rightly so. So the Trump campaign very much still sees a way to shoot the gap and win here, but it's going to have to take some movement at the end. The stimulus thing is one of those things that they think is a chance to really move some votes, to say that help is coming. Another one is that final debate at the end of the week that the White House is certainly pointing very, very hard toward.
Actually, Derek, let me just jump in here, Eric and Dana, Derek and Anna, if I could. I just was thinking, as you mentioned, it's not clear that Republican senators will do what Trump says. The Republican Party has been pretty obedient to the president for the last 4 years. Does it tell you something about their expectations for the outcome of the election if they don't do what he says now?
It would certainly be an interesting deviation. I think it's a good point to make because polls tell us that Republicans on the base are broadly pretty happy with Donald Trump. Among self-identified Republicans, he does tend to get about 9 in 10 or more saying that they think that he's doing a pretty good job. So to the degree that people are willing to distance on a very key priority of the president, that is indeed notable. The other thing I'd say is this. As you click closer and closer and closer to these election deadlines, the Senate is such that the power of even one Republican senator grows and grows and grows. So there is a chance to stop this. There has been some conversation among some Republicans that they're starting to sound worried about increasing deficits. And Democrats are saying that that's a preparation for if and when Joe Biden takes over to try and throttle some of the spending plans that he has. So you're actually seeing some of this rhetorical pivot onto things like that, in campaigns, onto being a check against a President Biden. It's subtle. It's not too loud, but you can start seeing it if you look.
If you vote for Biden, he will surrender your jobs to China. He will surrender your future to the virus. He's going to lock down. This guy wants to lock down. He'll listen to the scientists. If I listened totally to the scientists, we would right now have a country that would be in a massive depression instead of we're like a rocket ship. Take a look at the numbers.
And experts have said and have been saying for the last month and a half that nearly another 200,000 lives are likely to be lost in the coming months between now and the first of the year if we continue to refuse to follow science. Because he refused to embrace wearing a mask. How many times on television do you see make fun of Biden wearing a mask?
I love the Republicans, and we have some great, but they have to learn to stick together better. You know, we have some stupid people.
Folks, I mean it when I say this. It's time to restore America's soul. It's time to rebuild the backbone of America, the middle class, and this time bring everybody along, no matter your race, your age, your religion, your gender, ethnicity, or disability. We can do this.
What we saw last night was original. Is it a new path? Will it endure?
Oh, geez, Dom, that's hard to say. It certainly wasn't Kennedy-Nixon. But I will say, Tom, it was more informative than actually the first debate. Of course, people would say, hey, that's a pretty low bar. I thought that last night, Biden had a couple rough patches, which were mentioned at the top of the in the segment here. The question from Stephanopoulos about expanding the size of the Supreme Court. But by and large, I think he avoided making unforced errors, which I think his team will take as a win at this point in the race. Trump, was interestingly, I mean, I thought Trump was alert. He was feisty, quite combative, I think, with Savannah Guthrie. And I don't know how that'll play. I would.
Peter, I don't want to interrupt you, but look, we're going to get the play on this all through the day. What I want to know from you is going from Kennedy-Nixon up through the debates of the 80s and the 90s when you were at MIT, and now on to the formula. Is this going to be the new formula for debates?
Well, it could be something like this. I think people the debate format has clearly broken down in this cycle. And the amount of information that comes from them is limited. On the other hand, the problem here is that you don't really get to see them head to head, and so I think that's a complication, and that's a problem. I have to think that this is not the way it's going to be in the future, but I'm not sure we're going to go back to the kinds of debates that we have had in the past, especially if you've got people basically just filibustering during the debate.
Professor, what's the one thing that we need to know? Whether people show up and vote? And actually looking at what we're hearing right now, is turnout going to be record-breaking?
Turnout looks like it's going to be very, very big right now, as Donald Trump might say. I mean, I'm keeping my eyes on two trends they're cross-cutting, I would say. The first is we're seeing a spike in early voting numbers, but we're also seeing a rise in Republican voting registration. On early voting, it looks like basically the president may have scared many Democrats and independent voters into voting early. By the end of this week, the expectations are that 40 million Americans will have cast their ballot. That is a huge number when you think that in 2016, the total number of ballots that was cast was 138 million. So that's a big deal. And it could mean a lot it could mean that we have a much clearer picture on election night in some of these bellwether states like Florida and North Carolina about who will be the eventual winner, because their votes will be tallied much sooner and early, and they also tally quickly the mail-in ballots. But there's also, I just want to point this out, there's another underreported story, I think, on white non-college educated voters. In crucial battleground states like Florida, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, they are registering to vote in much greater numbers than in 2016. And I think this is good news for Donald Trump, especially given the problems that he appears to be having with white college educated voters this time around.
But, Professor, if there's a big turnout, as expected, and we trust the polls, and that seems to be what you're intimating, what needs to happen from now until November 3rd for Joe Biden not to become president?
Donald Trump needs to change the narrative, and he's running out of road. I mean, the problem is that the contest right now remains where it's been since late spring. It's basically a referendum on his handling of the pandemic, and everything he's tried to change the conversation hasn't worked thus far. That's what he's got to do.
Peter, you wrote with Peter Harris for Chatham House last year a brilliant essay on dysfunction in this nation and the American century. We've clearly observed dysfunction in this process, including what we witnessed last night. How's that American century doing?
Not too good right now, Tom. And so that's the problem, is that right now the country is deeply, deeply polarized, and it just has trouble getting things done programmatically. This didn't start on Donald Trump's watch, but it got worse on his watch. And frankly, you know, it's going to be a problem if Joe Biden does win, if the polls hold up and so forth, and he does win, he's going to have a problem on his hands going forward because the country is very divided. That is the challenge. And it's a challenge for what the country is trying to do in foreign policy. Frankly, I think the biggest challenge for the next president is to figure out a way of reconnecting what the country tries to do internationally with its domestic political economy. That's broken right now.
I mean, so we know the news flow. Are we any closer to a deal, really?
Well, David, clearly both sides now are saying they do want a deal. We had something of a time frame outlined over the weekend, like you mentioned there, although it's not necessarily about 48 hours, but it sounds like both sides are willing to at least come to the table ahead of the election. But there's still some way to go yet. You know, there are two figures going around. On the Democrat side, you're talking about 2.2 odd trillion. On the Republican side, 1.8 odd trillion. President Trump is saying he's willing to go higher than all of it. So clearly there is a way to go yet. It will still be a challenge to get a deal done by the election. But at the same time, both sides are talking, and that's come a long way from where we were a few weeks ago when all of the negotiations were called off.
And we've seen the economic data out of the US continuing to surprise and come in above expectations. How does that factor into the debate around additional stimulus? Does it reduce the need for stimulus in the near term?
Yeah, well, quite right, Tom. Clearly, the US economy has come back a long way from the depths of the downturn. We had retail sales on Friday showing a big rebound over September, the strongest in many months. But I think there are several warnings that the recovery is uneven at the same time. The labour market rebound is slowing down. We know also, of course, that the coronavirus infection rate is picking up again across the US. So that's why there's this commentary that the economy still needs a lot of public sector support, still needs a lot of government spending to make sure that it is sustainable. And indeed, over the weekend, we had several big global policymakers make the same warning, not just about the US, but about the world, that the world economy has rebounded so far, but to make it to a full recovery, we still have a long way to go yet. And that's why there's a big push on for the US to deliver fiscal stimulus, and indeed governments around the world to deliver fiscal stimulus also.
We're inside this massive fulfillment center just south of Beijing. It's run by JD.com, one of the biggest e-commerce companies in China, one of the biggest e-commerce companies in the world. You can compare it potentially to Amazon. And it's about the size of 22 American football fields. It's absolutely vast. They only employ about 1,500 people across all of that space because it's heavily automated. So they are sorting the packages here. They go down the carousel, across and through this warehouse space, and this is just one warehouse of many in this area, into the back of trucks, and then they ship them through North China into towns and cities across this part of the country. And this is really kind of symbolic of where the Chinese government wants its economy to move in terms of logistics and e-commerce and also consumption. They really want Chinese people to spend more, particularly as the pandemic spreads across the rest of the world but is under control here in China, and amid the trade tensions, they want Chinese consumers to be digging into their pocket and spending more. We've seen some economic data out just in the last day. Retail sales were up, for example, 3.3%, well above the estimates, well above what we saw in August, suggesting that China's consumer, which have been pretty reticent, that they're now coming back. They're willing to spend on everything from restaurants and haircuts, but also to electronic goods, the kind of items that we're seeing shipped out here. Whether that will be sustained will be kind of key to just how the economy here continues to recover and whether that momentum can continue. But this kind of thing, in terms of logistics, speed, efficiency, automation, very much front and center of what China's government wants to do in terms of moving its economy forward. Again, question marks over whether or not Chinese people really do feel that they are ready to spend and continue to spend heavily. But for the moment, it seems like they are dipping their toe back in the water, and that could prove positive for China's economy, could actually prove positive for the global economy as well.
Now, President Trump and Joe Biden competed in dueling town halls in different cities and on different TV networks. But front and center of both events, the coronavirus.
We make up 4% of the world's population. We have 20% of the world's deaths. We're in a situation where we have 210,000+ people dead. And what's he doing? Nothing.
I knew it was a big threat. At the same time, I don't want to panic this country. I don't want to go out and say everybody's going to die.
Joining us now is our senior editor, Derek Wallbank. Derek, first and foremost, did you watch it? What was your main takeaways from both of these dueling debates?
I did, Anne-Marie. I've sort of flipped back and forth between the two of them because they started at the same time. It was impossible to watch both of them. I think, though, when you looked at both of them, if you're a political obsessive, you really took the time to do both of them. The stylistic difference between Trump and Biden is very, very clear. Trump clashed a bit with the moderator in his town hall. Biden stayed afterward to talk with these undecided voters who were in his town hall. I mean, it really couldn't have been more different stylistically. So I think that was clear there. But it's really hard for me to understand how this is going to play with these undecided voters because, as you say, you can't actually watch two things on television at the same time. It would have been very difficult if you're trying to make up your mind.
Yeah, and also, Derek, more than 17 million ballots have been casted. At this time, in 2016, it was just over 1 million. I mean, how many voters could they actually swing last night?
Well, and the thing that I would add to that, Anne-Marie, is that a lot of the ballots that have come in so far have been Biden ballots because we're seeing signs that Democrats are voting by mail and early a lot more than Republicans have. So Democrats are banking their votes right now. So in terms of converting Biden voters to Trump, you're losing opportunities by the day to be able to do that. The key votes that are outstanding now, and day by day will be among those outstanding, are those votes who are sort of maybe softer Biden voters who would have been Trump voters last time. Those are the sort of persuadables that are out because, I think people are missing this, but as we go further and further, the level of persuadable voters, it's not just that they go down, but it's that the very identity of those persuadable voters shifts. And so it will be those softer Trump voters, those softer Biden voters. Those are the folks who are going to be available even for conversion because Democrats are banking the ones that they can as fast as possible.
So today is the deadline. You talked to George Stephanopoulos over the weekend, said 48 hours. That's up today. I understand you have a call scheduled with Secretary Mnuchin at 3 o'clock today, Eastern Time. What are the prospects? What do you need to hear on that call to move forward?
Well, first, let me welcome you to the Speaker's office. I have behind me a great founder of the Republican Party, Abraham Lincoln, who said public sentiment is everything. With it, you can accomplish almost anything. Without it, practically nothing. And I think the public sentiment is there for us to crush the virus. And that is our main goal in this legislation so that we can open up our schools, open up our economy safely. There's no reason why our schools shouldn't be the safest place for our children to be, and that our workplace should be someplace where workers can feel safe to come without fear of catching something that they bring home. So I'm optimistic because I do think we have a shared value, not many, but a shared value that finally is they want to crush the virus. And that's been a change from even over the weekend when they put forth language that wasn't respectful of what we needed to do from the standpoint of science to crush the virus. We had to do to recognize the disproportionate spread of this virus in communities of color, where a child who is African American will be 5 times more likely to go to the hospital with COVID than a white child, or a child who's Hispanic 8 times more likely. So now they've come back and returned that language that addresses the disparity issues, that is more scientific about testing, tracing, treatment, wearing your mask, separation, sanitation, and the rest, because we can stop the spread as we hopefully wait the soon vaccine. We want it as soon as it is safe and efficacious, not one day later, but no one day sooner either.
So, Madam Speaker, from the beginning, you said that is your #1 priority of crushing, as you say, this virus. You've been steadfast in that. Do you have language in front of you right now that is close enough that you think you can get to a deal, at least in principle, in one more phone call with the Secretary of the Treasury?
On that score, they've come a long way on that, I have to admit. So this morning, today, let me just say what the 48 hours was designed to do, for us to exchange all the unresolved issues. What is your best language? What is our best language? And let's see where we are. Now let's weigh the equities. We all want to get an agreement because people need it, and it's urgent, and our economy needs it. And so that's what, hopefully by the end of the day today, we'll know where we all are. We have one little bump in the road with the Appropriations Committee that has, I'm not sure they're going to be ready, but let's hope they are. We're starting to write the bill, and then we can have the negotiation. But I'm optimistic. It is, legislation is tough because you're coming from 2 different perspectives on it. But as long as we know that we want to keep the American people safe, that means, though, that we have to support our state and local, our first responders, our healthcare providers, our teachers, et cetera, that we have to depend on science to crush the virus. And we want to put money in the pockets of the American people so that they can have some confidence and spend in our consumer economy to inject demand in, create jobs.
So take us through the process, if you could. You're in the room, we're not in the room.
Yeah.
What sort of language do you need to be able to say, yes, we think this will work? I assume you don't need the entire bill to be written. That takes some time. But what do you need to have reduced to writing so you know you have a meeting in the minds enough to say, yes, we can make this work?
Well, we are, again, things have different weight. But as I said, honor our heroes, crush the virus, money in the pockets of. And within those, we have to have more money for state and local, because those are the people who meet our needs. They are getting fired, going on unemployment. That doesn't seem to make sense. So that's one place where we need more work. We have still some language that we have to deal with in terms of health, beyond the testing, tracing, treatment, mask, all that. We have to have better language, improve the language on healthcare providers, as well as the vaccine, and it's within range. And then in terms of money in the pockets, we're still fighting for an earned income tax credit, child tax credit, refundability for the low-income family, working families in our country. As you have seen the statistics over the weekend, 6 to 8 million more people will fall into poverty because of COVID, and we think we should be investing in them. Economists tell us, help the neediest, they'll spend it first. So it's the right thing to do from a compassion standpoint, but it is also from an economic standpoint. And then we just have some differences within there. But now but the 2 bookends of our differences right now, since you asked, one is state and local, and the other is liability. And right now, by the time I speak to the secretary at 3 o'clock, I think that we will have language countering what they have in the bill, because safety in the workplace for us is not an issue. It's not a provision in a bill. It is a value. These families, many of them essential workers, go to work. If they don't even get unemployment insurance if they're concerned about going to work because they might catch the virus because the provisions haven't taken place. So again, safety in the workplace, very important. I'm hoping that we can come to terms on that So those are the two bookends. In between, we have some differences. And of course, they don't want to do anything for elections. I'm very concerned about what they're doing on census. It's so unconstitutional. But again, we may have to live to fight another day on that. I don't know. They've said they have no movement on the census, which is in defiance of the Constitution of the United States, that every person in the country should be counted. The Supreme Court just ruled in favor of the president that he could stop counting people, but the Congress can change that. And that's what we hope to do.
Madam Speaker, I would love it if you'd want to negotiate this with me. You're not going to do that. I recognize that. But can you give me this sort of sense when it comes to that liability, one of the two bookends you described, is it binary? That to say, is it all or nothing, or can there be some wiggle room in between so that there's some language the Republicans could accept, but it goes farther than what the current law is?
Well, to understand that issue in this legislation, what Senator McConnell has in there is something that is not coronavirus-centric. It's for 4 years. It applies to all kinds of other things, and it's not to the point. So that language should easily be changed. You know, he's doing tort reform when we're trying to do safety in the workplace. Now, they have come to good language on OSHA, our safety provisions in the bill, but their overarching McConnell language negates the OSHA regulation. So we're saying, if you believe that it doesn't negate it, write that into the language. Nothing in this bill shall undermine the ability of OSHA. You know, that's a traditional thing that we do. So that's one place. Now, I do believe that if someone is honoring the OSHA provisions, having good working standards and the rest, that could be an admissible defense, or should someone bring a case against them. So I think that there is a balance that can be struck, but it isn't the McConnell language. But we'll have our language to them. We're working very hard to protect the workers, but also to be able to come to an agreement.
That's very helpful, actually. Thank you so much, Madam Speaker. Give us some sense at the end of the day, whenever that is, tonight or whenever it is, how will we learn whether we may have a deal or not? I mean, I don't want to be sacrilegious. It's not choosing a pope, but what's going to be the puff of smoke? Will you tell us? Will you announce to the world, yes, I think we may have a deal, or you know what, the deal's off?
Well, the deal, let me just say, it isn't that this day was a day that we would have a deal. It was a day where we would have our terms on the table to be able to go to the next step. And again, but legislation takes a long time. You have to have every provision, you have to have the Congressional Budget Office score it, the Legislative Council to review it. So these things take time. It's not just sending you a note. It's legislation. And it's what I love to do. I'm a legislator. They're not necessarily legislators, so I'm trying to impress upon them, if we want to have this by Election Day, and I think we can, you have to engineer back from there to this week. Now, if we have our terms on the table, they may not be in agreement, but at least there's a decision to be made as to what's more important or less important in light of weighing the equities to have an agreement. And then in the next day or so, I'm not sure they're going to be ready with their appropriations language. I hope so, but so far it's a little bit behind and for what we've heard from there. Now, I'm an appropriator, and I think left to their own devices, the appropriators, Democrats and Republicans working together, can bring us to agreement. I think the Secretary believes that. I'm hoping that they are left to their own devices. And so, again, as I say to everyone, you're not going to love everything in here. It's a negotiation.
Right. It's legislation, exactly. Let's do exactly what you said. Let's go forward to Election Day and back time it, as we say in the broadcasting business. What do we have to do between here and there to get there? Assuming that you do have the basic terms you've worked out and you work on, when do you have to have the language of a bill? When do you have to call back your members for a vote? What does the next week or 10 days look like?
Well, of course, the final piece is the president signing the legislation. And for that to happen, it not only has to pass the House, but it has to pass the Senate. And you know, we're getting mixed messages. The Senate's saying one thing, the president says he wants to spend more money than I do. But as I've said before, it's not about the money, it's how the money is spent. You know, we want a child tax credit for the poorest kids in America. They want to retain a tax net operating loss benefit for the wealthiest people in our country. And we're saying, well, you know, how do we reconcile that?
Which
So
was
it's
in the
not
CARES Act,
price.
right? That was actually in the CARES
It's in
Act.
the CARES, and we take it out, and they're insisting on keeping it in. So as I say, it's never, not always just the price, it's the money and how it is spent. So that's one thing. So anyway, engineering back to have it for election day, I would think we'd have to have this finished by the end of next week. In order for that to do it, we'd have to have our legislation all written by the end of this week. Then it's, you know, you have all your procedural 72 hours of review for the world to see, and then it would come to the floor, and then the Senate, you know, has different procedures, so it would have to be, but this is really to have it for election. Now, I'm not, you know, we could still continue the negotiation. It might not be finished by election day.
Right.
It may be finished by election day, but I want it by the next Friday. See, I wanted it at a time where people could pay the rent. November 1st, rent day. Let's see if we can't do that. If that's not possible, it doesn't mean that the virus should not still be crushed, that we shouldn't be putting money in the pockets of the American people, that we shouldn't be honoring our heroes. We still should have a responsibility to continue the negotiations should we just not come to enough of an agreement, a reconciliation of our differences. But we're on a path. And you have to be optimistic. As I say, the Secretary and I say to each other, if we didn't believe we could get this done, why would we even be talking to each other?
It's fiendishly complicated and difficult and important. We're all very interested, as you can tell. There is a third party in this negotiation, which is the majority leader, as you've referred to him 2 or 3 times now. Are you confident that, in fact, you can come to terms with the White House, with the Treasury Secretary, and therefore presumably with the President, that the Republicans in the Senate will come along?
Well, the president says they will. And the president has sent Secretary Mnuchin for this negotiation. We've negotiated many packages, keeping government open on more than one occasion, negotiating appropriations and omnibus bills. We've had 4 COVID very bipartisan bills that we have negotiated. And people say to me now, why would you give the president a victory by getting this done? And I said, well, if there's collateral benefit for him, who cares? What we are concerned about are working families in our country. Same as they said when we did, as I've said to you before, when we did the U.S., Mexico, Canada free trade agreement, they sent us a terrible bill, disastrous for the environment, for American workers and the rest, but we improved the bill, we negotiated, and people said, well, that gives a victory to the president. I said, no, it gives a victory to America's workers. He's not that important that we would negate avoid an opportunity to help workers just because he would have collateral benefit. Now he brags about it, but it has no resemblance to the bill that he put forward. But nonetheless, okay, we negotiated, and it's the law. And I think it could be, not everybody doesn't agree with me, but I think it could be a template for other trade agreements to be made easier by setting certain standards that we agree to in a bipartisan way. Same thing with this. We can't make matters worse. People say, accept what they're saying. Well, that's not an agreement, accept what they're saying. But again, we can't make matters worse for families that are going into poverty. The raging coronavirus. I don't know who was advising the president on testing and the rest, but finally they came around to the fact that we had to do the testing. So that was a big improvement over the weekend.
Brendan, of course, we talk about Cathay and its various woes every time we get you on. Does this move the needle at all?
Yes. I mean, first of all, with the job cuts, they were inevitable. I mean, Cathay Pacific has been in crisis mode for like 1.5 years. So in addition to the 7 months of the global crisis, they had COVID earlier because of mainland China and Hong Kong, and they had, of course, the protests last year. So it's amazing, actually, that they've been able to not have job cuts so far. Almost the entire industry has had job cuts, and 20 to 30% is kind of a normal number. So it's not surprising that this has happened this morning, and they also announced the elimination of the Cathay Dragon brand, which is also not surprising. Silk Air, a similar brand, is going away in Singapore, and it makes a lot of sense to go forward with that now and slim down and become more efficient. So they can move on now and focus on better things like hopefully the start of the recovery in the international market, which will be very long and gradual. So it will take a lot of time. So they have to kind of become leaner and more efficient in the meantime.
That sounds like you expect more restructuring to come. But in terms of this Hong Kong-Singapore travel bubble, I mean, symbolically, it's a bit of positive sentiment, right? But the numbers are not exactly game-changing.
I mean, the numbers are game-changing relative to the current levels of traffic for Cathay Pacific and the Hong Kong hub, as well as Singapore Airlines and the Singapore Changi hub. I mean, these airports are going at, 100,000 passengers a month at the moment, and this bubble could potentially generate 200,000 passengers a month once it gets fully going. It won't be like that in initial months, but if it ramps up to what demand would be, and there's containment in both places, which is a big if, of course, it could become that significant. Now, the bigger picture, though, would be that this bubble is followed by lots of other bubbles for Hong Kong and Singapore, as well as bubbles throughout the region, which would help improve their transit traffic, make these hubs come back to life, basically, to some extent. It's not going to be a huge recovery until there's a vaccination, but we can see, traffic go up, to 20 to 30% normal levels at least next year. That would be the hope. So better than nothing.
Cathay saying that the restructuring will cut monthly cash burn by 500 million Hong Kong dollars in 2021. How much liquidity do they still have left, given that we really don't know when international demand will return to normal?
I mean, they had the big financial restructuring with the government coming in. So, I mean, Cathay Pacific as well as Singapore Airlines are pretty much the best position financially right now in terms of cash liquidity. I mean, they're in a very weak position with no domestic markets, but they're in a lot better position than most of the airlines, particularly in Southeast Asia. The other airlines besides Singapore Airlines Group are, haven't really raised liquidity, don't have much government support, and are really battling it out with the suppliers right now to avoid liquidation or bankruptcy. So, I mean, I think a lot of focus, or too much focus, is on Cathay and Singapore, when actually their long-term financial position is actually strong, and they have what it takes to weather this storm and come out on the other end, potentially in good position if there's consolidation in the region.
Here's a sort of an estimate from IATA when it comes to the demand levels for international travel. Take a listen first.
Frankly speaking, we think that it'll take until 2024 to get back to 2019 levels for international travel. Domestic travel will bounce back sooner.
2024 for international travel. How many airlines will remain in business until then, and how much more consolidation could we see?
Yeah, I mean, so the IATA has been saying this for a while now. That was Conrad Clifford for the head of IATA in Asia. I recognize the voice, and I agree. It's going to take until 2024 for a full recovery. And domestic is starting to recover, but it's a gradual thing. And international will start in earnest once there's a vaccination. But a lot of travel patterns will have changed, and it'll take some time for the airlines to recover. But they're restructuring now. I mean, that's why you see this job cut at Cathay, for example, and similar job cuts, 20, 30% at a lot of airlines, because they know that even in 2022, 2023, when there hopefully is a recovery to some extent and a vaccination, it's not just going to go back to pre-COVID levels. It'll take longer to get back to that level. So you can't just hang on to that capacity, to those jobs. From a financial perspective, the issue is that they're adding a lot of debt, and it's going to take a long time to pay back that debt. And this is going to be a hole the industry has to come out of for a long, long time. Not only airlines, but also the other companies around the airlines are going to start getting impacted more over the next year. But I mean, depending on the government support, I don't think we'll see that many bankruptcies. If the governments don't continue to support the airlines, then we might see more bankruptcies and collapses.
Brendan, I think the last time we spoke, we talked about Qantas as being one of the best positioned because of the strong domestic business factor. That's obviously taken a beating with the lockdowns and the closure of borders related to Victoria in particular. Are you still optimistic that they'll come out once we get domestic borders reopen?
Yeah, I mean, Australia is really underperforming domestically right now compared to other markets in Asia Pacific. I mean, domestic's been down the last few months, well over 80% still, and it should be doing a lot better. I mean, we've had the Victoria issue, but even excluding Victoria, there's just not enough domestic travel in Australia because of these border closures internally. So you only have that limited travel, like within Queensland and within WA for the most part. It's very limited domestic travel. So I think there's some hopeful signs now that some of those domestic borders, like Tasmania and hopefully Queensland and South Australia, NT is also opening up. So I mean, that's going to improve the situation. I'm only a little bit wondering about if WA is ever going to open up, but everyone else should open up. Hopefully by the end of the year, that will improve domestic. And also we have this better talk or more encouraging talk from Australia now about international, potentially a two-way bubble with New Zealand and maybe Singapore as well, and some other markets like Hong Kong. I actually see some opening up rather than waiting until middle of next year, which is what they were saying initially. So that's encouraging, but it's slow, and it remains to be seen if this gets implemented or not, because there's been so much U-turns in Australia as well as in a lot of the other countries. One month they say they make it sound like they're going to open up, and the next month they turn back around and make it sound like they don't open up. So let's keep our fingers crossed and be cautiously optimistic that some airlines are going to have some good news in the months ahead, and that the light's at the end of the tunnel, and that we're actually through the worst of this.
Wait lang, cut. Ano ba to? English, Tagalog? Anong comfortable ka mo? English? Tagalog, Taglish.
Okay. As you can see, we close some trades. We close here, here, and here. The remaining trades will stay open before they go into the money. And I think that's it for today. We will see you in the next live trading. Have a nice day. Bye bye.